The ruthless Mafia boss raises his son alone, until the new nanny arrives and achieves the impossible. What he saw on the security camera that night stopped him mid-step. She was sitting in the rocking chair, the baby pressed against her chest, his tiny head resting right where her heart beat the loudest. And for the first time in 3 months, that child was sleeping, not screaming, not refusing to eat, not slowly fading away, just sleeping, like he'd finally found the only place in the world where he felt safe. Rhett Donovan built a criminal empire across Chicago's underworld. By the time he was 35 years old, he didn't freeze. He didn't hesitate. He'd made sure nothing and no one could ever make him feel something he didn't choose to feel. But standing in the dark of his own hallway at 2 a.m, still in the 3-piece suit he'd worn to a meeting where not everyone walked out breathing, staring at that small, bright screen, something behind his ribs cracked open in a way he couldn't control. She'd been here less than a week. A 27-year-old former pediatric nurse from the South Side with a small suitcase and a smile that didn't ask anyone's permission. He didn't know her story yet. He didn't know what she'd lost. He didn't know that the child sleeping on her chest carried a secret in his blood. A secret that connected her to that baby in a way neither of them understood, and when that truth finally surfaced, it would shake the empire, the man, and everything between them. But that's later. Right now there's only this. A woman no one expected holding a child no one could reach, inside a mansion that had everything except the one thing that mattered, and a dangerous man watching from the shadows, feeling his armor crack for the very first time, and not knowing whether what comes next would save him or destroy everything he'd built. If this story hits you right in the chest, smash that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Now let's go back to the night it all started. The night Rhett Donovan came home to a house devoid of his wife's presence and realized that the cold absence of her voice was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. 6 weeks before that night. 6 weeks before Rhett Donovan stood in the dark, staring at the camera screen, and forgot how to breathe. There had been another night. A night when everything began to fall apart. That night Rhett returned to the Lincoln Park mansion close to midnight. His suit still crisp and perfectly pressed, but inside his head there still echoed the sound of bones breaking from the man reckless enough to go 3 months without paying his debt. The meeting in the wine cellar beneath the restaurant front had ended later than expected, because someone kept begging for more time. And Rhett hated begging more than anything. Begging was weakness. Weakness was death. He had learned that lesson when he was 11 years old, when his father was shot in front of his mother for daring to beg a crime boss for mercy. He stepped through the door and heard it, crying, but not the ordinary crying of a child. This was a raw, lung-tearing wail, hoarse and shredded, the kind of cry that came from a baby who had screamed for so long. His vocal cords barely had the strength left to vibrate. Micah was crying from the second floor, and that sound spilled down the staircase, struck the stone walls, and filled every inch of the 12-room house like an alarm bell no one cared enough to silence. Rhett called Phoebe's name. No one answered. He called again, louder this time. Still silence. He took the stairs 2 at a time, shoved open the door to the master bedroom, and saw the closet standing wide open. Phoebe's side was completely empty. Not a single dress remained. Not a single pair of shoes. Not even the Chanel perfume bottle she always left on the vanity, cleaned out so completely, it was as if she had never existed in that room at all. On the pillow lay a note in Phoebe's handwriting, rushed but steady. She hadn't been shaking when she wrote it. She had been calm. She had planned this. I can't. Don't look for me. 7 words. No apology. No explanation. Not one mention of Micah. Rhett picked up the note, read it twice, then let it fall from his hand as if he were dropping something already dead. He went straight to Micah's room. The baby lay in the crib, face flushed a violent red, diaper soaked and heavy, the bottle on the table long gone cold. Phoebe had prepared one before leaving. Maybe that was the only thing remotely resembling a conscience she had left behind. But cold milk didn't help, and a 6-week-old baby couldn't hold a bottle on his own. Rhett lifted Micah into his arms, and the boy was so small he nearly disappeared inside his hands. Those same hands that had once wrapped around throats, had once signed death orders, had once counted blood-stained money, and now they trembled as they supported the soft, fragile head of the 6-week-old son, whose mother had just abandoned him as casually as she might leave behind something she no longer needed. He went downstairs to the kitchen, one hand holding his son, the other mixing formula, his fingers shaking so badly he spilled the powder twice. The water was too hot, so he had to wait for it to cool, and Micah kept crying right beside his ear. That sound so close, Rhett could feel it vibrating in his jawbone. When the bottle was finally warm enough, he brought it to Micah's mouth, and the baby latched on and drank with the desperation of a child who had been hungry far too long, sucking so fast he choked, and Rhett had to pull the bottle away, wipe his mouth, then offer it again, slower this time. And standing there in the middle of a kitchen larger than the entire apartment where he had grown up, at midnight, alone, with a baby in his arms and milk on his shirt, Rhett Donovan spoke the first promise he had ever truly wanted to keep. "I won't leave you. Hear me. Not ever." His voice broke on the last word. No one heard him except Micah, and Micah was far too little to understand. But he had made the promise. He had promised he wouldn't walk away. He had promised he would stay. The only thing was, he hadn't promised that he would know how to be a father, hadn't promised that he would know how to hold his son without feeling as though he were cradling a living time bomb made of flesh and bone, hadn't promised that he would kneel to the child's eye level and show him that he was loved, because no one had ever taught Rhett Donovan how to do that. Not his father, who had died in a pool of blood before he could teach him anything at all. Not his mother, who loved him by working herself to death so he would have food to eat, but never had the time to sit beside him and say, "Son, I love you." Not anyone. That night, Rhett Donovan sat on the sofa in the darkened living room with his son against his chest until morning came. Not sleeping, not crying, just sitting there holding the boy and listening to him breathe. Micah was the only thing in this world that Rhett feared, not because he was afraid of losing him, but because he was afraid of something worse than loss. Afraid that he would stay and still not be enough. Afraid that his presence would never make up for the absence of the boy's mother. And over the next 3 months, that fear would prove itself true in a way he never saw coming. To understand why Rhett Donovan sat in the dark holding his son without knowing how to speak words of love, you have to go back much further. Back to Englewood. Back to the neighborhood where every child who grew up there learned one lesson before the first lesson at school. Never let anyone see that you're afraid. Englewood sat on the south side of Chicago, the kind of place where ambulances arrived 15 minutes later than they did on the north side. The kind of place where no one called the police when gunshots rang out at 3 in the morning because no one would come anyway. The kind of place where children learned to tell the difference between a handgun and a shotgun before they could finish the alphabet. Rhett grew up in a 2-room apartment on the 3rd floor of a grim, gray building, with peeling walls, rusted pipes, and a smell in the stairwell he never forgot, even after he was living in a multi-million-dollar mansion. The smell of dampness mixed with melted plastic, the smell of poverty, the smell of no way out. His father's name was Grant Donovan, a low-level enforcer for a small crew that controlled a few blocks around the neighborhood. The kind of man sent to collect protection money and deliver small packages. Not important enough to be protected, but involved enough to be killed when something went wrong. What went wrong came on an ordinary Wednesday evening. Rhett was 11 years old, sitting on the living room floor doing homework, because Grant used the dining table to count money. There was a knock at the door. Grant opened it. 2 shots. Grant fell backward into the apartment, blood spreading across the brown tile that Rhett's mother had scrubbed clean that very morning. Rhett watched his father die in 4 seconds. 4 seconds he was able to count, because his brain didn't know what else to do except count. 1. His father's eyes went wide. 2. His father's hand clawed at his chest. 3. The blood reached the table leg. 4. Over. No one called the police. His mother's name was Ruth. She dragged her 2 sons into the back room, shut the door, sat down against the wall, held Rhett and Derek tight, and didn't cry. Not one tear. Because Ruth Donovan understood that in Englewood, crying didn't save anybody. Derek was 17 then, Rhett's older brother, 6 years older. And Derek looked at his father lying there, then looked at his mother, then at his little brother, and made the decision Rhett never forgave. Derek left. Not that same night, but within 2 weeks of the funeral. Derek stuffed his things into a backpack and disappeared. Not one phone call, not one letter, never came back, leaving his mother and brother to fend for themselves inside the black hole their father had left behind. Ruth worked 2 shifts at an industrial laundry plant on the west side of the city. The morning shift from 5 o'clock until 1 in the afternoon, the evening shift from 3 o'clock until 11 at night. She came home at midnight with hands cracked open from chemicals and a back bent from standing 16 hours. She did that every day for 6 years, without rest, without complaint, without asking anyone for help. And on a Monday morning when Rhett was 17, she couldn't get up. Ruth Donovan died in her bed in her sleep, her heart stopping. The doctor said heart failure caused by chronic exhaustion. Rhett translated that into his own language as this. His mother had died from working too much so he could have food to eat, and not one person in this world had helped lighten her burden for even a single day. 17 years old. No father. No mother. No brother. No money. No one. Rhett stood alone in Oakwood Cemetery after his mother's funeral. The November Chicago air so cold his breath froze in front of him, and he finished learning the final lesson life had left to teach him. Weakness had killed his father. Devotion had killed his mother. And family had vanished with Derek. So the only things left were strength, power, and never letting anyone get their hands on anything important to him. Because once they had it, they would use it to kill him. From that point on, Rhett built. At 19, he ran errands for the crew that controlled a few blocks near home, making small deliveries, collecting money, the same kind of work his father had done. But Rhett did it differently. He watched. He counted. He remembered who owed whom, who hated whom, who was willing to betray whom, and he waited. At 22, he controlled 3 blocks, not through guns, but through information. He knew everything about everyone, and in the underworld, knowing the right thing at the right time was worth more than a weapon. At 28, he took down the old boss. Not loudly, not with public bloodshed. Just one meeting where the old boss walked in with power and walked out with nothing, because Rhett had already bought every person around him long before that day came. At 35, Rhett Donovan sat at the top, an underground empire spread across Chicago, its front being Donovan Holdings, a real estate corporation with offices on the Magnificent Mile, bank accounts most people wouldn't dare dream of, the best lawyers in the city, state-of-the-art security systems, and Silas Kwan at his side, the only man Rhett trusted, because Silas never begged and never wasted a word. Rhett had built all of it with his own hands, from nothing, from Englewood, from blood on brown tile and the chemical smell on his mother's hands. He had built an empire no one could touch, and he believed that if he could build an empire, he could build anything. But there was one thing that couldn't be built through strategy, couldn't be bought with money, couldn't be seized by force, and that was knowing how to love a child who was refusing to live. And Rhett Donovan was about to find out that the greatest empire he had ever built wouldn't help at all, while his son was fading right in front of his eyes. Rhett Donovan could build an empire from nothing, but he couldn't build a normal life, because he didn't know what normal even looked like. He had never seen a marriage work the way it was supposed to, had never seen 2 people love each other without someone dying or walking away. So when he met Phoebe Ashworth at a black tie gala at the Art Institute of Chicago in the year he turned 30, he wasn't looking for love. He was looking for a missing piece in the perfect picture he was painting for the outside world. Phoebe was 26, the daughter of Harrison Ashworth, a Wall Street financial titan with a branch in Chicago, the kind of family whose money was so old they didn't need to show it because everyone already knew. She was beautiful in the kind of way that made men forget the sentence they were in the middle of saying. Deep brown eyes, platinum blonde hair, a straight back, chin lifted, a smile that was just polite enough and never warm enough. That night she stood beside a Monet painting in the gallery room, a champagne glass in her hand, and when Rhett approached, she turned to look at him with eyes that made it clear she knew exactly who he was. She knew where his money came from. She knew that the Tom Ford suit and Donovan Holdings were nothing more than a layer of polished paint over whatever lay underneath, and she didn't ask, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't need to ask about something she had already decided to accept. They married after 1 year, a wedding at the Peninsula Hotel. 400 guests, fresh flowers flown in from Holland, a live jazz band playing, and not a single person in that room truly believed these 2 people were in love. But no one said it because at that level of society, marriage was an alliance, and an alliance didn't need love. It only needed mutual benefit. Phoebe got a powerful husband. Rhett got the cover of a respectable family and ties to the old money financial circles of the Ashworth name, and 4 years after the wedding, the Lincoln Park mansion looked perfect from the outside, but inside it was colder than a Chicago winter. They slept in the same bed but turned their backs to each other, ate dinner at the same table but looked at their phones, spoke to each other in the polite voices of 2 strangers trapped inside the same contract, and Rhett saw nothing wrong with it because he had never known what right was supposed to look like. Then Phoebe got pregnant. Rhett received the news in his study. Phoebe stood in the doorway, the test in her hand, her face neither happy nor sad. only flat and still like the surface of a winter lake. And she said the two words, "It's positive," as if she were reporting blood work results, not telling her husband they were about to have a child. But something inside Rhett changed in that moment. Something he couldn't name because he didn't have the vocabulary for this kind of feeling. It was like hope, but stronger. Like fear, but warmer. Like for the first time in 35 years of living, he could look ahead and see something beyond power and money. Micah was born at Northwestern Memorial on a Tuesday morning at 7:12, weighing 3.4 kilograms, crying loudly the moment he came out, and Rhett stood in the delivery room watching the doctor place the baby on Phoebe's chest and forgot how to breathe. Then when the nurse transferred Micah into his arms, Rhett held his son with arms more used to holding guns than holding people, and his hands shook so badly the nurse asked if he was all right, and he wasn't. He wasn't all right at all, because for the first time in his life, Rhett Donovan was holding something he was more afraid to break than any multi-million-dollar deal. He bent his face down toward Micah, looked at the tiny nose, looked at the closed eyes, and whispered, "You won't grow up like me. Hear me. You won't have to learn how to survive because I'll take care of it, I promise." But when he raised his eyes and looked at Phoebe, what he saw snuffed out half of that newborn hope. Phoebe was looking at Micah, but her eyes were empty. Not empty from exhaustion, empty because there was nothing inside them. No joy, no emotion, no connection. She looked at the baby who had just come out of her body, the way someone might look at a strange object they didn't know what to do with. Rhett saw that, but he said nothing, because he didn't know what to say. Because maybe he told himself it would get better, the hormones would settle, Phoebe would adjust, everything would be fine. Everything wasn't fine. 6 weeks later, Phoebe vanished. And that was the night everything collapsed. The night Rhett had already lived through. The night of the lung-tearing cries, and the cold bottle, and the promise made in an empty room. The night he discovered that his untouchable empire had a crack that no money or power could fill, and that crack was lying in his arms, weighing 3.4 kilograms, crying until his voice went raw, and completely dependent on a man no one had ever taught how to love. 6 weeks after the night Phoebe vanished, Micah was slowly dying, and Rhett could do nothing to stop it. Not dying from illness, not dying because someone had harmed him, but dying from refusal, refusing to feed, refusing to be held, refusing every hand extended toward him, as if this 3-month-old baby had, by the most primitive instinct, already decided that no one in this world could be trusted, and he would rather starve than take milk from a stranger. The first nanny lasted 3 days, a woman with 20 years of experience caring for wealthy children, but she had never met a baby who refused to live with such determination. Micah screamed every time she touched him, turned his head away from the bottle, fought until his face turned purple, and she quit, saying plainly that the baby needed a doctor, not a nanny. The second one was fired by Rhett after he checked the cameras at 2 a.m. and saw her scrolling through her phone while Micah cried in his crib. Rhett called Silas and said only one sentence, "Get her out of the house before I come downstairs." Silas understood, and the second nanny was gone before dawn. The third was a pediatric nurse practitioner. She lasted 2 weeks. Micah tolerated feeding from her just enough to survive, but never enough, and in the end, she resigned for a reason. She wrapped into one sentence, "I'm not used to working in a place where armed bodyguards stand outside a baby's room." Rhett didn't try to keep her because he understood that his world wasn't a place ordinary people could endure. The fourth left without giving a reason, simply leaving her key on the kitchen table one Tuesday morning and never answering her phone again. Dr. Gemma Thornton came to examine Micah at the end of the 12th week. She was the only pediatrician Rhett trusted because she had treated Micah since the first day, and she was blunt enough to tell Rhett what he didn't want to hear. That day she placed Micah on the examination table in the private room on the 2nd floor, weighed him, measured him, checked his reflexes, shined a light into his eyes, gently pressed his arms and legs, and through the entire exam Micah didn't cry, didn't squirm, only lay there with dull eyes staring up at the ceiling like a baby too exhausted to resist anything anymore. Gemma set down her pen, removed her glasses, and looked straight at Rhett. His weight is down 20% from his developmental benchmark. His reflexes are weak. His eyes aren't focusing well. Rhett, this baby is severely malnourished, and if there isn't improvement within a week, I'll be forced to admit him to Northwestern, start intravenous fluids, and you know what happens when a 3-month-old baby is hospitalized for malnutrition while his mother is missing, and his father is the only one caring for him. Rhett knew. Hospitalization meant medical records. Medical records meant mandatory reporting. Under Illinois law, doctors and nurses were required to report any suspected case of child neglect. Reporting meant CPS. Child Protective Services would open an investigation, and an investigation meant government people digging into the life of Rhett Donovan. And if they dug deep enough, they would touch the very thing the FBI had been trying to reach for 10 years, a string of dominoes Rhett couldn't allow to fall. Silas stood in the corner of the room, silent the entire time, and when Gemma left, he said only one sentence in a flat voice, sharp as a blade: "Find someone. Fast. Before Friday." Rhett sat in his study that night, staring at the camera feed from Micah's room. The baby lay in the crib, eyes open, not crying, not moving, just lying there. And that image was more terrifying than any night Rhett had survived in Englewood, because the fact that the baby wasn't crying anymore meant he had given up. 3 months old and already given up. And Rhett, a man who had never given up in his life, was completely powerless. Margaret Byrne came to him the next morning. She was the 62-year-old housekeeper who had served in the mansion for 15 years. The only person in the house who dared knock on Rhett's study door without an appointment. She sat across from him and said, "I know someone. I used to work with her years ago at Cook County Hospital. A friend of mine is the head nurse there. And she told me about a pediatric nurse, the best in the unit. Children cry all day, and the moment she lifts them, they go quiet, like magic." Rhett didn't look up. Margaret continued, "But she left the job 3 months ago. She lost her baby, a little boy only 3 months old, sudden infant death syndrome. She's been shattered ever since. But Rhett, I trust her like a sister. If anyone can save Micah, it's her. And maybe Micah can save her too." Rhett looked up for the first time that morning, looked at Margaret, then back at the camera screen. Micah was still lying there, eyes open, silent. "Call her in. Sign the contract. Monday morning." He said it, and lowered his gaze back to the pile of paperwork, not asking her name, not asking her age, not asking anything else. 2 references. Pediatric experience, available immediately. Enough. He didn't know that the woman about to walk through the iron gates of his house the following Monday morning wouldn't be bringing only a small suitcase and a broken heart. She would also be carrying an invisible thread that connected her to the baby lying in the crib on the 2nd floor, through something no contract could record and no camera could see: blood, and when that thread was dragged into the light, it would nearly burn to ash everything both of them were trying to rebuild from the ruins. On Monday morning, the iron gates of the Lincoln Park mansion swung open, and the woman Margaret had promised would come had arrived. Josie Callahan stood at the entrance with a small fabric suitcase, the kind people bought at Target for $30. Her brown hair tied in a loose ponytail, no makeup, old sneakers worn thin at the toes, and a light jacket that wasn't warm enough for a Chicago morning that month. She looked like someone trying her hardest, simply to show up, not to impress. And that was the first thing that made her different from everyone else who had ever stepped through those gates. The security cameras recorded the moment she stood there looking up at the mansion, paused for 2 seconds, took a long breath like someone about to step into cold water, then walked through. She was 27 years old, but her eyes looked older, the kind of old that didn't come from age but from loss, the kind of eyes only people who had buried something more precious than their own lives could ever have. Josie had grown up in Bridgeport, only a few miles from Englewood but a world apart. Bridgeport was a working-class neighborhood, not rich, but not dying either, the kind of place where people came home from work on time and locked the front door before 10 at night. Her father died young in a construction accident when she was 7. Her mother was a nurse at a community clinic, working 12-hour days but still getting home in time to check the homework of her 2 children. Her mother was the one who taught Josie that caring for other people wasn't a burden but a way of living, and Josie carried that lesson with her into nursing school, then into the pediatric ward at Cook County Hospital, then into every hospital room she ever stepped into. Her brother's name was Connor, 3 years older. Connor hadn't gone away to school. He stayed in Chicago and worked as a bartender at a club on the Gold Coast, living rough, laughing easily, loving his sister in the way men often do when they don't know how to say it out loud, sometimes calling to ask if she had eaten yet, and then hanging up, sometimes transferring a few $100s into Josie's account when he knew she was short without saying a word. Josie married at 24. Her husband was a construction engineer, kind, ordinary, the kind of man her mother would have nodded in approval at. And 1 year later, she gave birth to Theo, a son, 3.2 kilograms, healthy, loud crying, feeding well, and the next 4 months were the happiest 4 months of Josie Callahan's life. She sang to Theo every night. She talked to Theo all day, even though she knew he didn't understand yet. She placed her hand on Theo's chest each time he slept, so she could feel his breathing. Because she was a pediatric nurse, and she knew better than most that sometimes infants stopped breathing, and no one knew. But knowing didn't mean you could stop it. One night in October, Josie laid Theo in his crib after feeding him, checked the monitor, kissed his forehead, turned off the light, and went to bed. The next morning she woke at 6, made coffee, then went into Theo's room. He was lying still. His chest wasn't rising. His skin was cold. SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. No cause, no warning, no one to blame. The CDC records about 1,400 cases each year across the United States, and Theo was one of them. A number in a statistic, but the entire world to Josie. She held Theo's cold body and called his name, called and called until someone pulled her away. She doesn't remember who. She doesn't remember how. She only remembers the sound of her own voice crying out his name in that small room. Her husband couldn't bear it. 2 months later, they divorced. He wasn't cruel, just not strong enough to stay beside a woman whose grief had turned into darkness. And Josie didn't blame him. She understood, because she couldn't bear herself either. She left her job at Cook County, left the apartment, moved into a tiny studio on the south side, lost 10 kilograms, kept the refrigerator empty, kept the curtains closed all day, and existed, not lived, existed, until Margaret called and said there was a baby who needed her. And that sentence, "There is a baby who needs you," was the only thread strong enough to pull Josie out of the bottom. Now she stood in the living room of the Lincoln Park mansion, facing Rhett Donovan, a man standing straight with both hands in his trouser pockets, cold eyes, a rigid jaw, and a flat voice, like he was reading contract terms. "Your room is on the 2nd floor, next to the baby's room. The feeding schedule is on the table. Don't go into my study, ever. Don't ask about my work. Don't invite anyone to the house. Don't leave without informing Silas. If there's anything you don't understand, ask Margaret." 5 minutes. He laid out all the rules in 5 minutes, in the kind of voice Josie guessed he used when reading terms to business partners. Cold, precise, not one unnecessary word, and not once did he look her in the eye. "The baby's upstairs. He doesn't let anyone hold him. He cries a lot." He said the last sentence the way someone might comment on the weather, then turned away, preparing to leave. "I need to see the baby first." Rhett stopped, not because the sentence was confusing, but because of the tone. She had said it in a calm, gentle voice, but not as a request. Not adding, "if that's all right," or "whenever it's convenient for you." She said it as if she were stating a fact, not asking permission. And no one in this house, not even Silas, spoke to Rhett Donovan in that tone. He turned back and looked at her. The first time he truly looked into the steady brown eyes looking back at him without flinching, without fear, without being impressed by the mansion, or the suit, or the Donovan name. The eyes of a person who had already lost the most frightening thing there was to lose, and therefore had nothing left in this world powerful enough to make her lower her head. He said nothing. He only tilted his head slightly toward the staircase, meaning go upstairs. And Josie Callahan picked up her $30 suitcase and climbed the stairs of the multi-million-dollar mansion, each step light but sure, while Rhett stood below watching her, not yet knowing that the woman who had just spoken 6 words to him in a voice that didn't ask permission would become the one to change everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness. Josie pushed open the door to Micah's room, and the first thing she felt wasn't something she saw, but something she sensed. The room was cold. Cold in the way a place becomes when the curtains have stayed shut too long. The air stale. The smell of clean diapers mixed with medical disinfectant. More like a hospital room than a nursery. A white crib stood in the center of the room. The kind of expensive crib Josie recognized immediately, because she had once seen it in a catalog she couldn't afford when she wanted one for Theo. White painted wood rails, an organic mattress, Egyptian cotton sheets, everything perfect, except for the baby lying inside it, who looked as if he were disappearing into the mattress. Micah lay there, so tiny, eyes closed, skin so pale, Josie could see the thin blue veins beneath his temples. Breathing so faintly, she had to look carefully to see his chest rise, and the heart monitor on the table beside the crib blinked steadily like the only thing in the room still trying. Josie didn't lift Micah right away. The 4 nannies before her had done that, and all of them had failed. She knew because Margaret had told her on the way up the stairs. "Don't rush to pick him up, Miss Josie. He's afraid of strangers' hands. The moment someone lifts him, he screams." And Josie understood more deeply than Margaret imagined, because she was a pediatric nurse, and she knew that an abandoned child isn't afraid of unfamiliar hands. He is afraid of being held and then put down, afraid of getting used to someone and then losing them, rejecting people not because he hates them but because he is protecting himself. 3 months old and already protecting himself. And that made Josie's heart ache in a way she had thought she was too numb to feel anymore. She pulled the little chair from the corner of the room, placed it beside the crib, sat down, didn't touch the crib, didn't touch Micah, just sat there, and began to sing. A lullaby she had once sung to Theo every night for 4 months. The song her mother had sung to her when she was little in Bridgeport. A simple melody, simple words, and this was the first time she had sung it since the last night she laid Theo into his crib. Her voice shook on the first note, shook so badly she almost stopped, because that note pulled memory behind it, pulled the scent of Theo's hair, pulled the feeling of his small body lying on her chest for the last time, but she didn't stop. She swallowed her tears and kept singing. Soft, gentle, steady, like water moving over stone. 5 minutes. Micah opened his eyes. He didn't cry, didn't thrash, only opened them and looked. Pale blue eyes, clear and fixed on Josie with a concentration no 3-month-old baby should have, as if he were trying to figure out who she was, trying to sort her into one of 2 places, the person who would stay or the person who would leave. Josie didn't look away. She looked back, singing and looking at him at the same time, letting Micah see her eyes, see that she wasn't in a hurry, wasn't afraid, wasn't going anywhere. 10 minutes. Josie slipped her hand into the crib, slowly, centimeter by centimeter, placed her palm on Micah's chest, lightly enough that it was almost not a touch at all, just enough for him to feel warmth, and Micah didn't fight, didn't turn away. She lifted him, slowly, one hand supporting his head, one hand supporting his back, exactly the way she had lifted hundreds of babies in the pediatric ward at Cook County, but this time her own hands trembled too, because he was so light, lighter than Theo had been at 4 months, light enough that she could feel his ribs through his clothes, and she placed Micah against her chest, right where her heart was beating. Micah squirmed for 1 second, 2 seconds, then pressed his face into her neck, his nose against her skin, and went quiet. Completely quiet. Not quiet from exhaustion. Quiet because he had found something. The kind of silence that comes when a child has found the one place where he feels safe enough to stop fighting. Josie stood perfectly still, not daring to move, one arm around Micah, the other hand resting on his back, feeling his tiny, warm breaths against her neck, and she cried, silently, tears running down her face that she didn't wipe away because she didn't want to lift her hand from Micah's back. 15 minutes. Margaret appeared at the door with a warm bottle. She stopped and looked at the sight before her, Josie gently swaying with Micah on her chest, the baby's eyes open but calm, and when Josie carefully brought the bottle to Micah's mouth, he latched on and drank, really drank. Not just a few reluctant sips before turning away like he had with the 3rd nanny, but drank steadily, drank enough, drank with the hunger of a child who had gone too long without food and had finally found the person he was willing to accept it from. Margaret stood at the door with one hand over her mouth, eyes red. She had been in this house for 15 years, had watched 4 nannies fail, had listened to Micah cry himself hoarse every night, and now she was watching him take a bottle in the arms of a girl she had brought into the house only that morning, and she didn't understand how, but she knew she had been right. Margaret Byrne had been right. Josie looked down at Micah, looked into the pale blue eyes gazing up at her while he drank, and she felt something strange, not just relief, but a thread pulling her toward this baby more strongly than anything she had ever felt except with Theo, and she didn't understand why. She thought maybe it was because she was a nurse, and this was professional instinct. Maybe because Micah was the same age Theo had been when Theo died, and her body was responding to memory. Maybe because she was too lonely, and the baby needed someone too badly, so that the 2 empty places had simply fit together. She didn't know the real reason. She didn't know that the blood in her veins and the blood in Micah's body shared half the same inheritance, that her brother Connor Callahan was this baby's biological father, that Micah, by the most primitive instinct of an infant creature, had recognized the scent, the heartbeat, the frequency of the voice of someone who shared his blood. And that was why he chose her. Not magic, not luck, but blood, calling to blood. But that truth was still deep beneath the surface, unseen, unguessed. And before it rose, there would be good days, days when the girl with the small suitcase and the baby who had refused to live would save each other little by little, one day at a time. But there would also come a day when the secret in Micah's blood would be dragged into the light, and that day would nearly destroy everything all of them were trying to build again. The first thing Josie did on Tuesday morning, her second day in the mansion, was open the curtains in Micah's room. The two heavy gray velvet panels that no one had bothered to pull back for the past 3 months were drawn wide apart, and light poured in. Chicago's morning sun at that time of year wasn't brilliant, but it was bright enough to wake the room, bright enough for Josie to see dust floating in the air like tiny particles stirred from a long sleep, and Micah lay in his crib with his eyes open, staring at the light with the kind of wonder only a 3-month-old baby could have, as if he had just discovered that a world beyond the curtains existed. From that moment on, Josie never closed the curtains again. In the mornings, she cracked the window open to let the breeze in. In the afternoons, she carried Micah to the glass and showed him the oak tree in the garden, the bird on the branch, the clouds drifting past. She talked to Micah all day long, not in the sing-song voice adults use with babies, but in a normal voice, as though she were speaking to someone who was listening. "The weather is beautiful today, Micah. The wind is a little cold, but the sun is warm. I think we should go out into the garden for a little while this afternoon. What do you think? Do you like the sunshine?" And Micah looked at her with those pale blue eyes, focused as if he were trying to understand every word. Of course he didn't understand, but he listened. He listened to her voice, the rhythm of it, and that was enough. She sang while feeding him, softly, a different song each time, but always in the same low, warm tone. She asked Micah whether he liked the milk a little warmer or a little cooler, then answered for him herself. "Yes, I know. A little warmer, right?" She changed his diaper while telling him stories about a duck she invented on the spot. And Margaret stood in the doorway watching, shaking her head slightly. Not because she disapproved, but because she couldn't believe it. 15 years in this house, and this was the first time she had ever heard anyone speak to a baby in this mansion as though he mattered. The house itself began to smell different. The scent of warm milk from the kitchen at 6 in the morning when Josie made bottles, the faint perfume she sprayed on her wrists, nothing expensive, the kind sold at Walgreens, but its soft white floral scent drifted through the second-floor hallway. The smell of baby detergent after she switched to a gentler kind without chemicals, because Micah's skin was sensitive. Margaret noticed first. She said to Silas in the kitchen, "The house smells alive now, Mr. Silas." Silas didn't comment, but he didn't object either, and for Silas Kwan, not objecting was the strongest form of agreement he had. Micah changed day by day. On the 3rd day, he finished a full feeding without turning his head away. On the 4th day, he wrapped his fingers around one of Josie's and didn't let go for 20 minutes. On the 5th day, he slept for 3 straight hours on her chest without startling awake, and that was a new record in the past 3 months. Doctor Gemma Thornton came by at the end of the week to check him, weighed him, measured him, tested his reflexes, and this time Micah kicked when Gemma pressed lightly against the sole of his foot, the reflex strong and clear, his eyes focusing better, and Gemma looked up at Josie standing beside the crib with an expression Josie couldn't quite read, whether it was praise or surprise or both. "He's gained 400 grams in 1 week. Reflexes are clearly improving. His eyes are beginning to track." She paused and looked at Josie for 1 more second. "I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it. Don't change a thing." Josie nodded and said nothing, but inside her chest, something warmed for the first time after 3 frozen months. The feeling of being needed, the feeling of still being useful, a feeling she had thought had died with Theo. Midweek, on Wednesday, Rhett came home early. Not early by the standards of ordinary people, but early by the standards of Rhett Donovan. 4 in the afternoon instead of 10 at night. The final meeting had been canceled because his business associate had been summoned by the FBI. So Rhett left Donovan Holdings on the Magnificent Mile and drove back to Lincoln Park without calling ahead, without informing Silas, without thinking much about it. He stepped through the door, took off his shoes, and was heading toward the staircase when he heard a sound from the 2nd floor, a sound he didn't recognize at first because he had never heard it in this house before. It wasn't crying. It wasn't the monitor. It wasn't the heavy silence that had become the soundtrack of the mansion for the past 3 months. It was babbling, a small drawn-out ah, then ooh, then ah again. The sound of a baby trying out his voice, discovering that his mouth could make sounds other than crying, and woven through it was Josie's voice, light and amused. "Oh really? Is that so? Go on, tell me the rest." And then what happened? As though the baby had just said something fascinating, and she was listening with complete attention, Rhett stood at the foot of the stairs, one hand on the banister, one foot on the first step, and didn't go any farther. He stood there listening to his son make sound, make a voice, for the first time in Micah's life, the first time it wasn't crying, and he realized something that made him grip the railing harder, that he, Rhett Donovan, Micah's father, had never heard his own child's voice. 3 months. He had lived in the same house with that baby for 3 months, and the only things he had ever heard from him were crying and silence. And now a girl who had been there less than a week had done what all his money, all his power, and 4 professional nannies had failed to do. She had given his son a reason to speak. He stood at the foot of the stairs for a long time, listening, only listening. And something was changing in this house, in the air, in the light spilling through windows that had once always been shut, in the scent of warm milk and white flowers. And inside him too, in the place where he had built walls beginning at 11 years old. Something was cracking, slowly, gently, like ice thawing at the start of spring, and he didn't know whether he should be afraid or let it happen. That night, Rhett didn't go upstairs to the bedroom. He went straight into the kitchen after standing at the foot of the staircase listening to his son babble, until the small sounds began to fade, and Josie started singing a lullaby, which meant Micah was falling asleep, and Rhett didn't want to go upstairs because he didn't know what to do with what was happening inside his chest, so he did the thing he always did when he didn't know what to do. He poured whiskey. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the small light above the vent hood. Rhett sat at the marble counter with a glass of Macallan in his hand and listened as the house gradually quieted. Then came the soft sound of footsteps on the stairs. Josie came down to the kitchen. She didn't see him right away because the kitchen was dark and he was sitting in the corner. She walked straight to the sink, turned on a low stream of water, and began washing the baby bottles, carefully. Each piece, the nipple, the ring, the bottle itself, with the kind of care Rhett recognized wasn't there because she was hired help, but because she cared. Then she turned and saw him sitting there in the dark. She startled slightly but didn't cry out, only paused for a second before continuing to wash. She had lived in a Mafia house for a week now, and she had already gotten used to people appearing in the shadows. 1 week. Rhett said it in a low voice, the whiskey turning slowly in his hand. Josie turned back, shut off the water, and dried her hands on a towel. "You've been here 1 week," he babbled for the first time today. "The 4 before you couldn't do that in 3 months. He looked at her. "What did you do?" Josie didn't answer right away. She leaned back against the sink, both hands resting on the counter behind her, thinking, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was choosing how to explain it in a way this man would understand. Because after 1 week, she had already realized that Rhett Donovan understood the language of power, strategy, and calculation. But the simple language that he didn't know very well. "I let him hear my heartbeat." Rhett frowned. Josie continued, her voice calm, not lecturing, not teaching, simply speaking. "For 9 months in his mother's womb, the clearest sound a baby hears is a heartbeat. He hears it every day, every night, constantly. It's the safest sound in the world to him, more than a voice, more than music, more than anything else, because a heartbeat means someone is there. A heartbeat means he isn't alone." She paused. When Phoebe left, Micah lost that sound. People came in, fed him, changed his diaper, held him, but no one held him close enough, long enough, for him to hear a heartbeat again. He isn't rejecting milk, Rhett. He's rejecting people, because no one has been giving him what he actually needs, to be held close enough to know that someone is here and not leaving. The kitchen went quiet. The refrigerator hummed steadily. Rhett looked down at the whiskey in his glass, slowly turning it over the stone surface, the small light reflecting through the amber color of the liquor. And he thought, how long had it been since he had held Micah? He carried his son. Yes, he carried him every night home, lifted him to check on him, lifted him so Margaret could change his clothes, But carrying and holding were two completely different things. Carrying was keeping someone in your arms. Holding was staying. Carrying was with your hands. Holding was with your whole body. And Rhett realized that he had never held his son, not once. He had kept the boy in the two strongest arms on the south side of Chicago, but he had never pulled him close enough to hear his heart beat. And that wasn't Micah's fault. Wasn't the fault of any nanny. It was his, because he had built walls around himself so thick that even his own son couldn't get through them. "You can turn in for the night." His voice came out rougher than he wanted. Josie looked at him for one more second. A look without judgment, without pity. Only a look. Then she gave a small nod and went back up the stairs. Her footsteps light, soundless, and Rhett sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, the whiskey untouched after that. 4 words echoing over and over inside the mind that knew how to handle schemes and strategies and wars worth millions of dollars. "Hear my heartbeat." The simplest 4 words anyone had ever said to him, and they changed him more than any battle he had ever won or lost. Because battles were things he knew how to fight, but holding his son close enough to hear his heartbeat was something he had never known how to do. And tonight, for the first time, he wanted to learn. The following afternoon, Josie had Micah lying on the soft mat in his room. She had just finished feeding him and was letting him lie there and play, his tiny hands reaching up and grasping at the air, his eyes wide open as they moved around the room with a kind of curiosity that hadn't existed a week ago. The baby was coming back to life, and anyone who looked could see it. Margaret came in carrying a stack of clean towels, set them on the shelf, then stood beside Josie and looked down at Micah, and she was quiet for a moment, in the way people are quiet when they are deciding whether they should say what is on their mind. Then she spoke. "He looks like his mother." The eyes. Josie looked down at Micah, at those clear, pale blue eyes staring back up at her, and gave a small nod. "Beautiful," she said simply, because to her that was the only truth she saw. Beautiful eyes, nothing more. But Margaret didn't stop. She sat down on the edge of the bed, both hands resting on her lap, and her voice dropped lower. Not a whisper, but the kind of voice people use when speaking about something they have held inside too long. "Mr. Rhett's eyes are dark brown, dark as black coffee. Every Donovan on either side of the family has brown eyes. I know because I've been in this house for 15 years. I've seen pictures of his father, his mother, Derek. All of them had brown eyes." She looked at Micah. "That baby has a specific, piercing shade of electric blue eyes, eyes that didn't match Phoebe's own dark ones, but held an intensity that she alone recognized from a different man's face." Josie followed Margaret's gaze, looked at those pale blue eyes, and for the first time she felt something strange that she couldn't name. Not suspicion, not worry, but a flicker of familiarity, as if she were seeing some feature she had seen somewhere before, in someone else, but she couldn't remember where and didn't know why. It only flashed through her and was gone, like hearing an unfamiliar song and swearing you must have heard it once before, yet not being able to remember when. Margaret continued, her voice even softer. "Phoebe left, and everyone said postpartum depression. The doctor said that too. But I was in this house every day, Miss Josie. I saw Phoebe in those 6 weeks before she left. She wasn't sad. She was afraid. Afraid in a different way. The way a person is afraid when they're carrying a secret they can't let anyone know. I saw the way she looked at Micah, and what was in her eyes wasn't emptiness the way Mr. Rhett thought. It was panic, like she was seeing something in that baby's face that she didn't want anyone else to see." Josie listened and said nothing, because she didn't know what to say. She had only arrived the week before. She didn't know Phoebe. She didn't know the history of this house. She only knew Micah, and the pale blue eyes looking up at her, and that strange feeling of familiarity returned again, stronger now, as if she were looking at someone she knew but couldn't remember who, and she gave a small shake of her head to push it away because it was ridiculous. She thought it was ridiculous. Maybe because Micah was the same age Theo had been. She was projecting her own feelings onto the baby. That had to be all it was. What Phoebe was afraid of, I don't know. Margaret finished, then stood up, looked at Micah one last time, and walked out. But outside the nursery, in the hallway, Rhett Donovan was standing against the wall, both arms folded across his chest, motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead at the empty space before him. He had been standing there since Margaret began speaking. He had heard every word. Margaret walked past him, saw him there, paused for a second, then kept going without saying anything because she knew there were moments when her employer needed silence more than words. Rhett remained there another 10 seconds, then turned and went straight into the study at the end of the hall, closed the door, didn't turn on the light, sat down in the leather chair, and looked into the darkness. Brown eyes, blue eyes. Phoebe was afraid. Afraid of what? The question wasn't new. It had been in his head since the night he read the note. I can't. Don't look for me. He had buried it, because in his world there were truths that, once dug up, would force him to act. And when Rhett Donovan acted, it was never gentle, so he buried it, let it lie beneath the layers of work and power and sleepless nights while Micah cried. But today Margaret had dug it back up, and now the question was staring straight at him from the dark. What was Phoebe afraid of? The truth was somewhere, maybe in the pale blue eyes of the baby in the room next door, maybe in the past Phoebe had carried with her when she ran, and Rhett didn't yet know that across the city, in a 42nd floor apartment with a view over the Chicago River, Derek Donovan was also staring at a photograph, one taken from the mansion's security cameras that he still had access to because Rhett hadn't yet changed the codes. A photograph of Josie Callahan holding Micah, and Derek was looking at the South Side girl's eyes with the smile of a man who had just found the knife he needed to drive into exactly the right place. That night, after Micah fell asleep, Josie did what she had done every night since coming to the mansion. She went out to the back porch, sat on the stone steps, and looked up at the sky. The back porch of the Lincoln Park mansion overlooked a wide garden Rhett had never once stepped into. An old oak tree, a dark wooden fence, a lawn cut neatly by the gardener every week even though no one admired it, and tonight the Chicago sky was clearer than usual, clear enough to see a few dozen stars through the city lights. Josie sat there barefoot, on the cold stone, a cup of tea in her hands, her hair down, and looked upward with the kind of eyes that would tell anyone watching that she wasn't looking at stars. She was looking at someone who wasn't here anymore. Rhett didn't know exactly when he had begun noticing this habit of hers. Maybe on the third night when he checked the cameras and saw her sitting outside at 11, maybe on the fourth night when he passed the back door and saw her silhouette in the dark. But tonight he didn't pass by. He opened the door and stepped out. Josie heard the door, turned, saw him, and said nothing, only shifted slightly to one side, not quite inviting him, but not refusing him either. And Rhett did something that 2 weeks earlier he would never have done. He sat down on the step. No chair, no table. Just sat on the cold stone beside her, still in his suit but with his tie removed. And for the first time in this mansion, the kingpin of Chicago sat lower than every chair he owned. They were silent for a while, not awkward, not strained. The kind of silence that comes when two people have grown familiar enough not to need to fill it. Then Josie spoke, not looking at him, still looking at the stars. My son liked looking at the ceiling. At 3 months old, he already knew how to look up and smile, smiling for no reason, just because he saw the ceiling fan turning. She paused. His name was Theo. Rhett didn't speak. He only listened. I had Theo when I was 26. 4 months. 4 months that were the happiest of my life. The kind of happiness people don't know how to treasure until it's gone. Her voice didn't shake. She had told this story inside her own head enough times that her voice no longer shook, but her eyes were different. Her eyes were wet in the darkness, and she thought Rhett couldn't see that, but he could. One night in October, I fed Theo, checked the monitor, kissed his forehead, laid him in his crib, turned off the light. She swallowed. The next morning I went into his room and he wasn't breathing anymore. Cold. His skin was cold. She tightened her grip on the teacup. SIDS. The doctors said no one was at fault. No cause. No warning. Nothing could have prevented it. She took a long breath. I held him, Rhett. I held my boy when he was already cold and called his name. Kept calling until the ambulance came and someone pulled my hands away. I don't remember who. I don't remember how. I only remember the sound of my own voice calling my son's name in that small room and no one answering. Silence. The soft sound of wind moving through the oak tree. My husband couldn't take it. 2 months later, we divorced. He wasn't a bad man, just not strong enough to stay beside someone whose grief had turned into darkness. I don't blame him, because I couldn't stand myself either. She looked down at the teacup, then lifted her eyes to the stars again. Micah was the same age Theo was when. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Rhett understood what filled that blank space. He sat still for a long time, looking into the dark garden, And for the first time since Phoebe left, he said the thing he hadn't said to anyone. Not to Silas, not to Margaret, not to anyone in the world. Phoebe didn't leave because of depression. Josie turned to look at him. That's what everyone says. The doctors said it too. She wrote it on the note too. But I looked into her eyes for 6 weeks after Micah was born, and I didn't see sadness. I saw emptiness. He paused. She looked at Micah and there was nothing in her eyes. No love, no fear, nothing. She left because she didn't want this baby. His voice was low, not angry, not bitter, only the truth he had chewed over in the dark for 3 months. And I did. I wanted him. I just didn't know how. And now when I watch you, the way you are with him, I see the empty space I left behind. I see the thing I'm missing, and it's clearer than anything I've ever seen in my life. A long silence followed. Josie looked at him, looked at the face of the man who ruled half of Chicago, sitting on a cold stone step, and admitting that he wasn't enough. And she didn't say it's okay, didn't say you're a good father, didn't offer anything easy or hollow. She only said 3 words. It's not too late. 3 words. Gentle. True. And Rhett Donovan, the man who had built an empire with contracts and schemes, the man who had never been shaken by any threat, sat on the back steps of his own house and felt those 3 simple words from a South Side girl land heavier than anything he had ever signed in his life, because they weren't a promise, weren't a contract. They were the truth, the kind of truth he couldn't buy, couldn't threaten, couldn't control, and that was exactly why it reached the place no one had touched in 25 years. They sat there a while longer, silent. 2 people on the steps, stars overhead, wounds in their chests, and something new began between them that neither of them was ready to name. But at that same moment, in a penthouse across the Chicago River, Derek Donovan was sitting in front of a laptop screen. On the screen was a photograph of Josie Callahan, taken from the mansion's security cameras. And beside the photograph was a file one of Derek's men had just sent over. Josie Callahan, 27 years old, Bridgeport, South Side, younger sister of Connor Callahan. Derek didn't yet know who Connor Callahan was, didn't yet know the thread connecting Connor to Phoebe to Micah, but he knew one thing. This girl was something Rhett cared about, and anything Rhett cared about was the perfect weapon to use against him, and Derek Donovan had just found his weapon. On Saturday morning at 9, the iron gates of the Lincoln Park mansion opened without anyone in the house pressing the button, because Derek Donovan still had the old gate code Rhett hadn't gotten around to changing, or more accurately, hadn't even thought about changing, because for the past 3 months, he had more urgent things to worry about, and Derek knew that. Derek always knew when his younger brother had left an opening. Derek walked into the mansion through the front door as if he owned the place. Gray suit, polished Oxford shoes, a smile on his face that Josie would later learn was a warning sign, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, and he went straight toward the kitchen because he could hear something there. Something that shouldn't have existed in a Mafia kingpin's house on a Saturday morning. The sound of a child laughing. Josie was sitting at the kitchen table with Micah in a high chair. She was feeding him a supplemental cereal doctor. Gemma had recommended, because Micah needed more nutrition beyond milk. And Micah was doing something no one in that house had ever seen before. The baby was laughing, not the little coos and babbles of the past few days, but real laughter, gums showing, eyes squinting. The laugh of a baby who had just discovered that sweet potato mash smeared across his own nose was the funniest thing in the world, and Josie was laughing with him, wiping Micah's nose with a cloth, and then dabbing a little more puree onto his chin, just so he would laugh again. And that Saturday kitchen smelled of warm sweet potato, held the sound of a baby's laughter, held sunlight pouring through the windows Josie had opened, held all the things a house needs before it can truly be called a home. Derek stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked. His eyes swept across the scene before him. Josie, with her hair loosely tied back, wearing a white t-shirt, no makeup, laughing with Micah as though she were the baby's mother. Micah in the high chair, clutching her finger and grinning with his bare gums. And he looked at that scene with the eyes of a man searching for a weakness, not the eyes of an uncle. "And who are you?" Josie looked up, saw the man in the doorway, and although she had never met Derek before, she recognized immediately that he was dangerous, not because of the way he looked, but because of his eyes. Brown Donovan eyes like Rhett's, but missing the thing she had started to see in Rhett lately, missing the ability to soften. "I'm Micah's nanny." "Nanny." Derek repeated the word, stepped into the kitchen, pulled out a chair, and sat across from Josie as if this were his table, leaning forward to look her up and down with an appraising stare. A nanny, and yet here you are feeding my nephew breakfast like you belong here. Very comfortable for someone who just arrived. How many days has it been? 1 week, Josie answered, her voice even. 1 week. Derek nodded, his smile widening, becoming more dangerous. 1 week and already acting like this place is home. Southside girl, aren't you? Bridgeport? I'm good at reading people. He tilted his head. So what game are you playing in this house, sweetheart? Josie didn't move, didn't lower her eyes, didn't blush. She looked straight at Derek with the same eyes that 3 months earlier had looked death in the face when it came for her son and hadn't collapsed, and she answered in a flat, clear voice that didn't ask permission. I'm feeding a hungry baby. You can either sit down quietly or get out of the kitchen. Derek hadn't even had time to react before Micah's face started to crumple. The baby felt the tension in the air in the way children always do even when they don't understand it. His face tightening, his lower lip pushing out, and Josie reacted on instinct before she had time to think. She turned in the chair, lifted Micah out of the high chair, gathered him against her chest, one hand supporting his head, one hand shielding his back, and angled her shoulder toward Derek so that her back faced him and Micah was completely covered. Pure protective instinct, the same instinct a lioness uses. Not taught, not learned, only awakened the moment something threatens a child she loves. Derek looked at that and smiled even wider. He had just found what he needed. Proof that this girl wasn't only a nanny. This girl cared. And in this world, caring meant you could be used. Interesting, Derek said, standing up. And at that exact moment, Red appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had heard from the stairs. Silas stood 1 step behind him, his hand already inside his suit jacket exactly where the Glock rested. Derek. Rhett's voice was low, not loud, and didn't need to be loud. The kind of voice everyone in the council who had lasted long enough knew came right before someone got hurt. What are you doing in my house? Derek turned toward him, his smile still in place. Visiting my nephew. Is that a crime? No one invited you. I don't need an invitation. I'm family. Derek stepped toward Rhett and lowered his voice, but not low enough, deliberately leaving it loud enough for Josie to hear. The council is talking, little brother. They're saying you've lost focus since Phoebe left. They're saying you let some girl with no known background into the middle of your house, to care for your son, to eat at your table. He flicked a glance at Josie, then looked back at Rhett. They're asking me whether you're getting weak, or whether you're letting that Southside girl lead you around by the nose. What do you think I should tell them, Rhett? Silence for 3 seconds. Silas moved half a step forward. Josie held Micah tighter, and the baby had already gone quiet, his face buried in her neck. Get out of my house, Rhett said, each word distinct, not repeated. You're making a mistake. I'm protecting my son and the person caring for my son. If you have a problem with that, bring it to the council. But get out of my house, now. Derek looked at Rhett, looked at Silas, looked at Silas's hand inside the jacket, then looked at Josie holding Micah with her back turned toward him. And he calculated, not because he was afraid, but because he knew today wasn't the day. Today he didn't have enough yet, but he would. Derek stepped out, past Rhett, paused for a second, and said quietly enough that only Rhett could hear, I'm going to find out who she is, and when I do, you'll wish you had listened to me today. Then he left. The front door closed. Silence returned. Josie was still standing in the kitchen with her back turned, holding Micah, her shoulders trembling slightly. Not because she was afraid of Derek, but because of adrenaline. Her body had shifted into protection mode and was only now beginning to come down from it. Rhett stepped closer and did something he had never done before. He placed his hand on Micah's back. The baby was still in Josie's arms, his large hand resting lightly against his son's tiny back, and his fingers brushed against Josie's fingers, because she was supporting Micah's back in that exact same place. Skin touching skin. Both of them aware of it, both of them silent, neither one pulling away. Are you all right? He asked. I'm all right, she said softly. Are you? He didn't answer. He only stood there, his hand on his son's back, his fingers touching hers, and felt something he had seen in Josie's eyes when she had turned to shield Micah. That thing was what he had been searching for all his life, without knowing he was searching. Someone willing to use their own body to shield a child without thinking, without needing payment, without needing a reason, simply from the instinct to love. And he was afraid because for the first time in his life, he wanted to keep someone from leaving without using power or money. Outside the mansion, in the black Mercedes pulling away from Lincoln Park, Derek Donovan took out his phone, dialed a number, waited through 2 rings, then said in a voice flat as a blade, "Find out everything about Josie Callahan. Family, siblings, former address, former workplaces. I want to know where she eats breakfast and who she sleeps with. Everything. Before Wednesday." After the day Derek came, something in Rhett changed. Not because he was afraid of his brother or because of the council's threats. Rhett Donovan wasn't afraid of those things. He changed because of the moment his hand touched Josie's on Micah's back, and neither of them pulled away. That moment told him there was something in this house worth coming home early for, and from that week on, Rhett Donovan began coming home before 7 in the evening. Silas Kwan didn't comment, but he had to rearrange the entire schedule. The meeting with the shipping partners moved from 8 at night to 5 in the afternoon. The call with the lawyers moved to lunchtime. The visits to debtors moved to the morning. And when one member of the council asked why the schedule had changed, Silas only said, "The boss is busy in the evenings," in a tone that made no one dare ask another question. On the first day, Rhett came home before 7. He stood in the doorway of Micah's room with both hands in his pockets, watching Josie feed Micah. And because he didn't know what to do, he simply stood there. Josie saw him, but said nothing. She didn't push, didn't suggest. She just kept feeding Micah and singing softly, and left the empty chair beside the crib there like a silent invitation. On the second day, Rhett sat in that chair, back straight, hands still on his thighs, sitting as if he were in a boardroom, but sitting. On the third day, Josie handed him the bottle, saying nothing, only handing it to him, and Rhett took it, brought it to Micah's mouth. The baby looked up, looked at his father, and drank, and that was the first time Rhett Donovan had fed his son without his hands shaking. On the fourth day, Josie said, "Hold him against your chest. Let him hear your heartbeat." And Rhett remembered the night in the kitchen, remembered those 4 words, and he placed Micah against his chest, right where his heart beat. The baby squirmed for 2 seconds, and then lay still, his ear pressed against his father's chest, and Rhett sat there without moving, feeling the baby breathe against him, feeling a weight so light he had to look down to make sure his son was still there, and something inside him, something he had built walls around since he was 11 years old, broke open. Not loudly, not painfully. It simply broke, gently, like snow melting. Then came bath time. Josie told him that tonight he was giving Micah a bath. Rhett looked at her as if she had just told him to defuse a bomb. But Josie had already prepared the small bathtub on the changing table. Warm water, soft towels, unscented baby soap, and she stood beside him giving instructions. One hand under his head, always support the head. The other hand does the washing, gently. He likes warm water. Rhett lowered Micah into the tub, his large hands, hands that had once wrapped around throats, had once pulled triggers, had once broken the noses of traitors, now supporting a tiny head no bigger than his fist, with a gentleness he hadn't believed he possessed. And Micah touched the water, squirmed, then kicked hard enough to splash water across Rhett's face, across Rhett's $200 shirt, even onto Josie standing beside him. And the baby laughed out loud, the sound filling the little bathroom. And Josie laughed too, really laughed. Not a polite laugh, or a laugh because Micah was adorable, but a laugh from somewhere deep inside her, the first real laugh she had given since Theo died, the kind of laugh she had thought she had forgotten how to make. And tears came at the same time as the laughter, but she didn't wipe them away because both hands were busy holding Micah's towel, and she let them stay, laughing and crying at once. Because sometimes healing looks like that. Rhett looked at her, looked at the tears and the smile living on her face at the same time, and he understood, without anyone explaining it. He understood that she was coming back to life, and that she was coming back to life here, in his house, beside his son. And he wanted her to keep coming back to life, wanted it more than he was willing to admit. That evening at dinner, Josie made roast chicken with mashed potatoes because it was the only thing she knew how to cook well, and she wasn't trying to impress anyone. When she finished and set the food on the table for Rhett, she started to carry her own plate upstairs the way she did every night. "Sit down," Rhett said without looking up, his hand cutting the chicken. "Eat with me. I'm the nanny, Mr. Donovan. You're the person who saved my son. Sit down." Josie looked at him for a second, then sat. And that dinner was the noisiest dinner the Lincoln Park mansion had ever known. Not because anyone said much, but because Micah was sitting on Rhett's lap, and the baby discovered that his father's tie was the most wonderful thing in the world. He grabbed the navy silk tie and stuffed it into his mouth to chew on it, drool soaking into Italian silk, and Rhett looked down, looked at the $400 tie being ruined by his son, and laughed. Not the polite laugh he used in meetings, not the social laugh he gave at galas, but a real laugh. From the stomach, from the chest. The kind of laugh Josie was certain was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard from this man. And when Micah heard his father laugh, he laughed too, chewed harder, drooled more, and Josie sat across from them eating mashed potatoes and smiling in that way where the eyes glow brighter than the mouth. Outside the kitchen door, Silas Kwan stood in the hallway with his back against the wall and his arms folded, listening to the laughter spilling out, and what happened next was something that if anyone told the council, no one would believe it. Silas Kwan, the coldest man in the Donovan Empire, merely dropped the Glock hidden inside his suit jacket, not because he was startled, but because he had heard Rhett Donovan laugh, truly laugh. For the first time in the 10 years he had stood beside that man, and his hand, a hand that had never trembled while pulling a trigger, trembled for 1 second before clenching shut again, and he walked straight into the sitting room and sat down alone, staring at nothing, because Silas Kwan had just realized that his employer was changing, and he didn't know whether the world they lived in would allow that change to survive. Rhett Donovan was learning how to be a father, learning how to be human, one dinner, one bath, one laugh at a time. But the Chicago underworld didn't care about a kingpin's progress toward healing. That world only cared about power, and when one kingpin softened, someone else hardened. And the evidence Derek needed to destroy Rhett was already on its way, faster than anyone inside that mansion imagined. That night, the back porch, the stone steps, the familiar place that had now become theirs. Josie sat barefoot on the cold stone with a cup of tea in her hands, and Rhett sat beside her on the step, because he never chose the chair anymore, and the Chicago sky was cloudier tonight. Though still open enough to let a few stars show through the breaks, they sat in silence for a while before Josie spoke. And this time, her voice was different, not the storytelling voice she had used the night she spoke about Theo, but the voice of someone who had thought carefully before opening her mouth and had chosen to speak plainly. I know things are changing, between you and me. I'm not blind. Rhett said nothing, only turned his head toward her. Josie kept her eyes on the garden, not on him yet. I know Silas carries a gun inside his suit jacket. I know the men who come to see you at midnight aren't coming to discuss real estate. I know Derek hates me not because I'm the nanny, but because I'm something you care about. And in your world, what you care about is what people use against you. She paused, took a sip of tea, then continued. A mafia boss and a South Side girl. I've seen that story before, Rhett. In movies, in newspapers, in the neighborhood where I grew up. None of those stories end well. Rhett looked at her profile in the dark, the line of her nose, her chin, her throat, and the eyes that were looking far away while seeing more clearly than most people he had ever known. You aren't afraid? Josie turned and looked at him for the first time in the conversation, looked straight at him in the way he had learned was the most honest version of her. I already lost my son, Rhett. I already held my child when he was cold in my arms. After that, there aren't many things left in this world that can scare me. She paused. But there is one. What? I'm afraid of loving Micah too much, and then losing again. Afraid that he'll become everything to me, and then one day someone will decide I don't belong here, and I'll have to leave. And this time, I don't know if I'll be able to get back up. Silence. Wind moved through the oak tree, the leaves whispering softly. I won't let anyone touch you. Or Micah. Rhett said it in a low, steady voice. The kind of voice that in the underworld meant when he spoke like that, people knew it wasn't a promise, but a fact. Because Rhett Donovan didn't make promises, he acted. Josie looked at him, and she saw that he meant it. She had learned how to read his eyes in these past weeks. Those dark Donovan eyes with something burning slowly behind the cold, and she knew he was telling the truth. But she also knew truth wasn't enough, because his world didn't run on promises. It ran on guns and money and betrayal. And in that world, love wasn't a shield. It was a weakness. Give me time, she said. I'm still learning how to trust again. Rhett looked at her for one long second. then answered in a voice so soft, Josie almost didn't recognize it as his, because it was gentler than any voice she had ever heard from this man. "Time is something I have. Patience is something you taught me." Josie turned to him and smiled, light and unexpected and impossible to hold back, the kind of smile that escaped before she had time to decide whether she should let it. And it was beautiful. That smile was beautiful in the dark, hanging there between them like a promise no one needed to speak aloud, because sometimes the strongest thing isn't words, but the space between two people when both of them know, and neither has touched it yet. And that night they stayed there a long while longer without saying anything else. Two people on the steps, stars slipping through breaks in the clouds, and something between them had been named, even though neither of them said it, and both of them knew that after that night, the line between Nanny and something more had blurred so completely, they could no longer pretend it was still there. On Friday night, 3 weeks after the night on the steps, Derek Donovan came back, and this time he didn't come alone. The mansion gates opened at 9 in the evening. 3 black cars pulled into the drive. Derek stepped out of the first one, and 2 men stepped out of the second. Josie didn't know who they were, but Silas did. 2 council members. Men whose presence meant this wasn't a family visit. This was politics, and Silas put his hand on his Glock and called Rhett downstairs immediately. Rhett came down the staircase, saw Derek standing in the middle of the living room with the 2 council members seated on the sofa, and understood at once that Derek hadn't come tonight to provoke him. He had come to open fire. Derek didn't greet anyone, didn't smile this time. His face was cold, and his eyes had that brightness of a man holding the knife he had been sharpening for 3 weeks. He placed a file case on the coffee table, opened it, and began laying out each paper, each photograph, from left to right, slowly, deliberately, like a man dealing cards when he knew he held the winning hand. The first photograph, printed from the security camera at the Velvet Room, a club on the Gold Coast, was dated 14 months earlier. In the picture, Phoebe Ashworth Donovan was stepping out the back door of the club at 2 in the morning, and beside her, with a hand resting on her back, was a man, tall, brown hair, pale blue eyes, wearing the easy smile of someone who had drunk just enough to become reckless. The second sheet was a printed file, the name at the top reading, Connor Callahan, 30 years old, bartender, Velvet Room, Gold Coast, Chicago. A headshot of the same man, and beneath Connor's file was another photograph, taken from the Lincoln Park Mansion security cameras, showing Josie Callahan holding Micah in the second-floor hallway. And beside it was her file. Josie Callahan, 27 years old, Bridgeport, younger sister of Connor Callahan. The last page was a DNA report, using a sample of Micah's hair taken from the pillow Derek had picked up when he came to the mansion last time, compared with Rhett's DNA from medical records Derek's people had gotten access to, and the result printed in bold at the bottom of the page read, Probability of biological father-child relationship, 0%, no match. Derek stood straight with his arms folded and looked at Rhett with the expression he had waited his whole life to wear. The girl you've been letting care for your son, feeding at your table, sitting on the back steps with every night, is the biological sister of the bartender who slept with your wife 14 months ago. He pointed at the DNA report. And Micah isn't your son, Rhett. He's Connor Callahan's son. Count backward 9 months of pregnancy, plus Micah's 5 months of age. It lines up perfectly with the night at the Velvet Room. Silence. The kind of silence Josie would later remember as heavier than any noise she had ever heard. Rhett said nothing. He picked up the DNA report and read it, line by line, number by number, his eyes moving across the page. And Josie, standing on the staircase looking down through the banister, saw his shoulders stiffen centimeter by centimeter, as if someone were pouring concrete into his spine. She had heard everything. She had been upstairs when she heard the gate open, and had stepped into the hall, stood on the staircase, heard everything from the first photograph to the last DNA result, and now she stood there, gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles had turned white, her face drained of color, because she had seen the picture of Connor, her brother, the brother she loved. The brother she hadn't known had slept with anyone 14 months ago, and everything fell into place at once like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was missing. Micah was Connor's son. Micah was her nephew. The pale blue eyes that had felt so strangely familiar were Connor's eyes, the Callahan eyes, her father's eyes, and the reason Micah had accepted her from the first day wasn't magic, wasn't nursing instinct, wasn't luck. It was blood. Blood recognizing blood. the most primitive instinct of an infant creature recognizing the scent and the heartbeat and the frequency of someone from his own bloodline, and she had held her own nephew every night without knowing it. I didn't know. Josie's voice broke, not loud, but enough for everyone in the room to hear, and she came down the staircase, her legs shaking, her eyes red, looking straight at Rhett. Rhett, I swear I didn't know. I didn't know Connor knew Phoebe. I didn't know Micah was my nephew. I came here because Margaret called. Because I'm a nurse. Because I needed a reason to get out of bed every morning. I didn't know. Derek opened his mouth, ready to say something poisonous. But Rhett cut across him with a single word so heavy, it seemed to force the whole room backward. Quiet. Then, in a lower voice, each word clear as a bullet. All of you, out. Now. Derek looked at Rhett, looked at Silas, who had drawn the Glock from inside his jacket, and was now holding it loosely at his side. Looked at the 2 council members who had already stood up, and calculated. He had already dropped the bomb. The bomb would explode on its own. He didn't need to stay and watch. The 3 men walked out. The door closed. Silas looked at Rhett, and Rhett gave the smallest nod. Silas followed them out, closed the living room door, and stood guard in the hallway. That left only 2 people. Josie stood at the foot of the stairs, tears running down her face, one hand still gripping the railing. Rhett stood in the middle of the room, the file still in his hand, his dark brown eyes fixed on her, and Josie couldn't read what was in them because she had never seen this look before. Not cold, not angry, not sad, empty in the way a person looks after everything has been pulled out of him. Your brother. Rhett said it not as a question. He's a bartender. I didn't know he knew Phoebe. I swear on Theo's life. Did you know Micah was your nephew? No. She was crying now. I didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't know. Rhett looked at her. Looked at the brown eyes staring back through tears. The eyes he had learned to read over these past weeks. The eyes he knew didn't know how to lie, because they had looked at him while she spoke of Theo without hiding a single tear, and he saw the truth there. Pain, shock, heartbreak, devastation. But the truth, she didn't know. She truly didn't know. He looked down at the paper in his hand. The DNA report. 0%. Micah wasn't his son. The baby he had held against his chest every night. The baby he had let hear his heartbeat. The baby he had learned to bathe and feed and laugh with. Wasn't his blood. Wasn't his bone. Wasn't his in any way except one. He had chosen him. He had chosen the baby from the first night, when he picked him up with shaking hands in the room Phoebe had abandoned, and that choice didn't need DNA to confirm it. Then came the cry from upstairs. Micah had woken up, crying, the familiar cry that 3 months ago had torn through lungs, but now was only a calling cry, the cry of a baby who knew someone would come. Josie turned on instinct, ready to go upstairs, but Rhett moved first. He went up the stairs, past Josie, paused for 1 second beside her without looking at her, then kept going, entered Micah's room, lifted the baby from the crib, and placed him against his chest, right where his heart beat, and Micah quieted quickly, because the baby knew this heartbeat now, the heartbeat of the man he called with the only babbled word he knew, da. Rhett held the baby with his eyes closed and spoke in a breaking voice, a voice that if the council had ever heard it might have toppled the empire in a single night, but he didn't care. You're my son. Hear me? You're my son. No blood required. No DNA required. No one gets to decide otherwise. I chose you on the first night, and I choose you now, and I'll choose you every day until I die. You're my son. Micah lay on his father's chest, eyes closed, one little hand gripping his shirt, and drifted back to sleep. At the bottom of the stairs, Josie sank down onto the last step, covered her face with both hands, and cried, not from fear, not from shame, but because she had just watched a man choose a child who wasn't his by blood, with pure love. The kind of love no contract could record, no DNA could prove, no power could buy, and she cried because she knew this was the moment when everything would either live or die, and she had no idea which one it would be. The next morning, Rhett summoned the council, not at the restaurant front, not in the wine cellar, but at the Lincoln Park mansion, in the living room, the same room where 12 hours earlier Derek had thrown the DNA file onto the table, because Rhett wanted them sitting in that exact place when they heard him speak, so they would understand that this was his house. And inside his house, he decided. 6 men sat around the table. Derek sat across from Rhett, confident, One leg crossed over the other, a thin smile on his face. He believed he had won after the night before because the truth was on his side. And in the underworld, truth was the most powerful weapon of all. Rhett stood. He didn't sit. Silas stood one step behind him, one hand inside his suit jacket. I know what you heard from my brother. Micah isn't my biological son. My ex-wife betrayed me. The nanny in my house is related to the child by blood. He looked at each man in turn. And this is my decision. Micah is my son. Legally. On paper. My lawyers are already handling the adoption documents. And no one touches that boy. Josie Callahan stays in my house. Her role in my house is my business, not the council's. Then he looked directly at Derek. Derek Donovan is out of the council. Effective immediately. Derek shot to his feet. You can't do that unilaterally. I built this. Rhett cut him off, his voice so low that Silas tightened his grip on the Glock. With my hands, with my blood. You walked away when our mother died. You came back when there was money, and now you use my son to try to overthrow me. He looked around the table. Anyone standing with Derek, stand up. I'll respect the choice, but understand the consequences. No one stood. 5 men remained seated in silence, because they knew this empire ran on Rhett Donovan, not Derek. And loyalty to the stronger man wasn't morality, it was survival. Derek looked around, saw no one rise, his jaw hardening. Then he picked up his coat and walked out of the mansion for the last time, the door slamming behind him, with a sound that felt like the final period at the end of a sentence that had lasted 25 years. When the council was gone, Rhett went upstairs and found Josie packing her things into the same little $30 suitcase she had brought with her, hair tied back loosely, eyes swollen from crying all night, folding each piece of clothing with the care of someone long accustomed to leaving. Where are you going? I thought after everything, you'd want me to go. Rhett stepped closer, gently took the shirt from her hands, and set it down on the bed. I just threw my own brother out of the Empire for threatening you. Do you really think I want you to leave? Josie looked at him, eyes red. But my brother. Your brother isn't you. Phoebe's fault isn't your fault. And Micah needs you. He paused. I need you. It was the first time he had said those 3 words. No detour, no metaphor. Stay. 1 word. But from Rhett Donovan it carried more weight than every contract he had ever signed. Josie looked at him, looked into the dark brown eyes, watching her without coldness, without command, only asking. And she set the suitcase down. A few months later, Phoebe Ashworth came back. She reached out through her lawyer, arranged a meeting, said she wanted to discuss Micah, and Rhett received her in the living room alone while Josie stayed upstairs with Micah. Phoebe was still beautiful, still cold, but something was different, thinner, more frightened. She spoke of regret, of mistakes, of a mother's rights, of the best lawyer her father had hired. Rhett listened to every word without interrupting, without reacting, and when she was finished, he answered in a voice calmer than she had ever heard from him. I know about Connor Callahan. I know about the night at the Velvet Room. I know about the DNA. I know everything. Phoebe went pale. You didn't leave because of depression. You left because you knew Micah wasn't my son, and you were afraid I'd find out. You left a 6-week-old baby in a crib with a soaked diaper and cold milk at midnight, and disappeared because you were a coward, not because you were in pain. Phoebe opened her mouth, but Rhett kept going. You don't get to come back. Not because I'm angry, but because Micah deserves real love. And real love doesn't run when things get hard. Phoebe left with her lawyer and never came back, and this time, no one stood at the window watching her go. A year passed. The Lincoln Park mansion wasn't cold anymore. The curtains opened every morning. The kitchen smelled like food. The hallways echoed with the pattering footsteps of Micah at 15 months old, already walking, short legs, uneven steps, falling and standing up again on his own, and the 2 clearest words in his babble were Dada and Jojo. Rhett came home before 7 every evening without exception. Silas had gotten used to it. The council had gotten used to it. The entire Chicago underworld had gotten used to the fact that after 7 in the evening, Rhett Donovan belonged to the house in Lincoln Park, and no one was allowed to disturb him. That night, the back porch, the stone steps, the stars overhead, the place that had now become the most sacred place in the mansion, even though it was only a set of cold stone steps. Josie sat barefoot with her tea, hair loose, Micah asleep in his room. Rhett sat beside her on the step, never the chair, and he was quiet longer than usual. "You're strange tonight," Josie said without looking at him. "Thinking. About what?" A long silence. Then Rhett spoke slowly, choosing each word. "I built everything with my hands. The empire, the money, the reputation." He looked down at his hands. "Then I found out that money without love is worth nothing." He turned toward her, took her hand in both of his, carefully, like he was holding something he was afraid to lose. "I don't have a ring. I didn't prepare a speech. I don't know how to do this the right way." Josie stopped breathing. "But I don't want one more night without you beside me. Not as the nanny, not under any contract title." He looked into her eyes. "Marry me, not because of what I have, because you taught me who I want to become." Josie looked at the stars, then at him, then down at her hand in his. "Rhett, I'm a South Side girl. No powerful family, no famous name, nothing that fits your world. I know. People will talk. People always talk. I learned not to listen. What if this doesn't work?" He tightened his hold on her hand. "What if it does?" Josie looked at him for a long time. That steady gaze that never flinched, the truest version of her. "I loved Theo more than anything. Losing him taught me that love isn't weakness. It's the only thing we ever really get to keep." She took a deep breath. "I'll marry you because of the man you chose to become, because of the father you became, because of the man who sits on these steps with me and listens when I talk about Theo as if it's the most important thing in the world. So that's a yes? That's a yes." He pulled her into his arms, right there on the steps, both of them barefoot, the Chicago sky full of stars above them, and Josie thought, with her face against his shoulder, that somewhere among those stars, Theo was smiling, that toothless 4-month-old smile, pointing her out to someone beside him and saying that his mother was all right now. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in June, not in a church, not at the Peninsula Hotel where Rhett had once married Phoebe with 400 guests and flowers imported from Holland, but in the back garden of the Lincoln Park mansion, beneath the old oak tree that Josie had pointed out to Micah every day through the second-floor window, ever since the first week she arrived, with flowers chosen by Josie herself, white daisies and lavender, the kind of flowers sold at the Lincoln Park Farmers Market every Sunday morning for $12 a bundle. And she bought 6 bundles, arranged them herself, placed them herself, and that garden that afternoon was more beautiful than any multi-million-dollar gala Rhett had ever hosted, because it was made beautiful by truth, not by money. The guest list was small. Margaret, Silas, Dr. Gemma, the pastor Margaret knew from church in Bridgeport, a few council members Rhett still trusted, and no one else. There was no need for anyone else. Micah was 18 months old, dressed in a tiny suit Margaret had specially ordered, and his most important job that day was to carry the rings. And he carried them, one hand clutching the little velvet box, the other shoving into his mouth to chew, because his baby teeth were coming in, and his gums itched. And he toddled across the grass on short, unsteady legs, nearly fell twice, got back up both times, then handed the ring box to Rhett, with a grin that showed off 4 brand-new baby teeth. Margaret had been crying from the moment Josie stepped out the back door in a simple white dress bought at Nordstrom Rack. Not a designer wedding gown, just a long white dress, but Margaret cried because she was looking at the South Side girl with the $30 suitcase who had turned this cold house into a place filled with a child's laughter every morning. And she cried because she knew that all 15 years she had spent in this mansion had been worth it for this one moment alone. Silas stood in one corner of the garden, with his back against a tree. Arms folded, face as cold as always, but his eyes were a little red, and when Margaret passed by and asked whether he was all right, Silas said, "Pollen allergy," in the flattest voice he could manage, then turned his face away, and Margaret didn't ask another question, because she knew that was how Silas Kwan cried. When the pastor asked Rhett whether he accepted, he looked at Josie, looked at Micah standing between them holding one hand in each of his little fists, then said, "I do, and I'm grateful." His voice steady but his eyes wet, and he didn't hide it because he had learned that tears weren't weakness. When the pastor asked Josie, she looked at Rhett, looked into the dark Donovan eyes she had learned to read over more than a year, then looked at Micah gazing up at her with pale blue Callahan eyes, then lifted her eyes to the sky for 1 second, only 1 second, just enough to whisper to Theo that his mother was all right now. Then she looked back at Rhett and said, "I do, with all that you are, not all that you have." Micah clapped in front of everyone. not because he understood what a wedding was, but because he saw people smiling and wanted to join in, and that tiny applause rang through the garden, while white daisy petals drifted in the breeze, and it was the most beautiful sound anyone there had ever heard. That night, after the guests had gone home, after Margaret had cleaned up and Silas had done one final security check before leaving, Micah slept between them in the big bed, lying on his back with both arms stretched wide, one hand touching Rhett's chest, the other touching Josie's arm, taking over the whole bed with the complete ease of a child who knew he was loved. The room was dark, stars bright beyond the window that Josie never closed the curtains on anymore. "What are you thinking about?" Josie asked softly. "Theo," Rhett said. She went quiet. "I'm thinking Theo sent you here, to take care of Micah, and to take care of me too." A long silence followed. Then Josie spoke, her voice gentle, the voice of someone who had finally found the thing she had believed was gone forever. "I think God gave me a second chance to love." And they lay there in the dark, Micah asleep between them, stars shining outside, and the strange warm peace of people who had finally come home for real. Sometimes life sends the right person when you least expect it. Sometimes love arrives with a small suitcase, a smile that doesn't ask permission, and the courage to sit down beside the darkness. And that is exactly the kind of love that changes everything. This story isn't only a love story between two people. It is a story about choice. The choice to stay when everything is falling apart. The choice to love after being wounded. The choice to become a father not through blood but through heart. And the choice to trust again after losing everything. In real life, we don't have to be a kingpin or a nurse to understand that. Every one of us has been afraid to love again after getting hurt. Every one of us has stood before the choice to leave or to stay. And every one of us has needed someone to sit down beside us in the dark without needing to say a word. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the new moving stories we bring every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it make you think of someone in your real life? Share your thoughts in the comments. We always listen from the deepest place in our hearts, and every line you leave is the strength that helps us keep bringing stories that touch the soul. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.